So, some interesting fallout from this whole Wu flu pandemic controversy. As I have been following, the U.S. increasingly, as was expected, is becoming, much more critical of China and their whole response, because, of course, even if you could say that the death count in this country is not nearly what any of us had feared at first, because, of course, there was a lot of uncertainty back in January when China was concealing all of their data, and it looked like things were really, really bad. We obviously knew it was much worse than China was telling us, but we just didn't know how bad. And based on all that, people took out of an abundance of caution and destroyed their economies to try and stop the spread of this disease. And so here we are, a few months later, and we're still in the midst of all this, and we're just wallowing in economic ruin. And on top of it, it's an election year. So it's pretty obvious that the administration needs someone to blame, and China's a very good candidate for that. Because we still don't know exactly what the origins of this virus is. Of course, many of us, going all the way back to January, were very suspicious of the Wuhan Institute of Virology and another biolab that they had there, about the and stories that had come out in the past few years about safety standards not being up to par at those labs, and the potential that the Chinese were working on either what some people were calling a bioweapon, or what other folks were referring to as gain-of-function research, which basically means that you, for purely scientific purposes, not for the purpose of using it as a weapon, we're trying to engineer these really super bad viruses and just see what they do. And so what the intention was, in that case, doesn't really matter. If it gets out, whether you had, neutral intentions or negative intentions in your development research, the result is the same. And so, but this is bleeding into more than just the issue of the virus and economics and all that. It's bleeding into every aspect of U.S.-China relations. Of course, the whole trade talk optimism that I was following for years, that was supposedly driving the stock market higher, is completely gone away. There's no phase one trade deal. There will never be a trade deal. We're going to have this ongoing trade war will continue forever because it's evolved into a very political war, which trade wars already are pretty political to begin with. And so the U.S. is adapting and shifting its its international relations strategy from being, I guess, more not conciliatory to China, but at least somewhat respectful of them, to being what the Chinese would consider to be much more confrontational. And that is embodied by Mike Pompeo right now, the Secretary of State and former CIA director, a veritable deep state spook, a usual suspects kind of guy, coming out and congratulating the President of Taiwan on, I believe, her re-election. I believe it's a woman. And the Chinese, of course, are not happy about this because dating all the way back to the Chinese Civil War, in which Mao conquered the country and draped his red flag over all of China, and I guess the only thing that he didn't he reconquered just about all of historic China, pre-Civil War China, pre-World War II China, including Tibet and Manchuria and all these other parts of China on the fringes. He did not get Outer Mongolia back. That was a country, I believe, that was within the Soviet sphere of influence, and so the Russians sort of protected their independence, and they're still independent to this day. And Taiwan was sort of a rump state of the old Republic of China, which was the dictatorship of Chiang Kai-shek, who lived until like 1971 or something. And so China considers Taiwan to be their property because they say, oh yeah, well, Mao became the leader of China, and we were became the new government of China, and we just never quite finished reasserting our influence in Taiwan. And so the way they look at it is, or the way they portray the situation is that, well, Taiwan's always been a part of China. It's just we don't have control over it right now. These rebels still have control over it, even though the government of Taiwan, technically predates Red China. And so China insists that the whole rest of the world should not acknowledge that Taiwan has a separate government, that's an internal Chinese affair, and that if you ever want to deal with Taiwan, you deal with Beijing. And so they want to subordinate this government, even if they're not going to, invade Taiwan and overthrow it right away. They still want to put this. They don't want to recognize Taiwan as a separate country with its own government. So the Taiwanese government then is not a part of Beijing's government, but they're sort of still considered a subsidiary to a certain extent. And so this is why almost no government in the world ever interacts with the Taiwanese government. They don't have official diplomatic relations, even though everyone else in the rest of the world recognizes, if you ask them personally off the record, yes, of course Taiwan's not a part of China. Everybody knows that. They have their own constitution, their own flag, their own leaders, and their own writing system. They don't even have the same written language as mainland China because Mao decided to throw the whole Chinese writing system out the window because he said, it's too hard. We need to dumb things down because Chinese people are stupid. That's how Mao felt. In Taiwan, they don't feel that way, so they still use normal Chinese writing. So with Pompeo coming out and congratulating the president of Taiwan on her re-election, it's a big slap in the face to Beijing. It's a way of saying, go screw yourselves, Xi, because we don't give a damn about what you say. We have no reason to be nice to you. We want to rub it in your face that Taiwan is not your territory. And in fact, not only is Taiwan not a part of China, it's not even affiliated with China. In fact, it's more within the sphere of influence of the United States. China is now a mortal enemy. Things certainly have changed since the Nixon administration, in which Nixon kicked the Chinese government off of the UN Security Council and brought Mao on. Because, of course, after World War II, the Allies, which were Chiang Kai-shek's China, the Soviet Union, France, Britain, and the U.S. were the states that founded the UN and became permanent members on the Security Council. Well, Nixon decided to, and of course the Chiang Kai-shek's government was, their seat on there was China's seat, because Chiang Kai-shek was recognized as the legitimate ruler of China, and that he had just been temporarily driven off the mainland onto Taiwan by the communist rebels. It's kind of a mirror image of how the Beijing government today views Taiwan. Well, the Western powers, by that I mean the U.S., of course, kept that line until Nixon went to China and decided to recognize Mao as the supreme dictator of all China. And so no matter really who was in power, you always had this one China policy, either one way or the other. It was either recognizing that Taiwan was the one true China, or recognizing that Beijing's government was the one true China. But now we have this, not really for the first time, because of course the U.S. has engaged with Taiwan a lot, sold them weapons and things, tried to defend their independence against China. We're once again seeing a shift towards recognizing Taiwan as a separate country, which is, like I said, just a microcosm of the growing split between China and the U.S. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm anticipating a kind of conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, militarily. That would be insane. But what I am saying is that you should watch this space and others, because there's been lots of rumblings about the geopolitics of the Pacific heating up, which I think are, of course, always political in this case. It's not so much resource-driven or anything like that. It's simply a way of these two countries, sticking, thumbing each other's, thumbing their nose at the other. So with that said, if you get anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.